Hey, what is going on, guys? So today we're going to be responding to, once again, Ben Shapiro's daughter, otherwise known as Brett Cooper. She released a video titled "Do the Opposite of What the Media Says," and this title definitely does a good job of catering to your average self-proclaimed critical thinking contrarian who is searching for new ways each day to be convinced of the vague claim they lied to us. In the past, when I've responded to Brett, she had the tendency to make very bold claims without evidence. Let's hope that doesn't happen again with this one. I'm sure it won't happen. Let's get right into it.
The tweet and the article in question was this: Americans are obsessed with protein. They eat about 2 times as much of it as the federal government advises. Oh no. And 60% of US adults are trying to get even more of it in their diets. Oh no, Americans are trying to be healthier in the midst of an obesity crisis. Excessive protein consumption could be making us sick. It is also wrecking the planet. How much protein should you actually eat per day? Find out here. And in less than 48 hours, it has almost 3 million impressions on Twitter alone. And again, like I said, for all the wrong reasons. My favorite comment was, "You guys are a bunch of soy boys." Literally, because they don't eat meat, apparently. They are literally just sitting around writing these articles eating tofu. The other top comments were perfect. One guy said, "As the federal government advises, the obesity epidemic should render anyone a laughingstock who believes anything the government says about food." Obviously, because how has that worked out for us? How has following their health guidelines worked out for anyone? Consider that seriously.
So, similar to Jordan Peterson, who by the way is also part of the Daily Wire, Brett Cooper seems to think that the government guidelines or the dietary guidelines are the reason why so many people nowadays are obese and sick. Now, seeing if this is true is actually quite simple. If people like Brett and Jordan believe that the dietary guidelines are the main reason why so many people nowadays are sick and obese, and this is a true belief, it must be the case that a large proportion of people have indeed followed the dietary guidelines in the past, 10, 20, 30 years. Because if this wasn't the case, how could you infer that the guidelines, which nobody or barely anybody follows, is the cause of most people being obese or sick? Well, I've covered Jordan Peterson's claims in the past that the guidelines are the cause of the obesity we see today, and funnily enough, he used the term epidemic of obesity.
Epidemic of obesity and diabetes.
The term is very similar to the term this poster used, which Brett Cooper showed in her video. I wonder if the person who made that tweet got the idea from Jordan. But anyway, here's my response to Jordan, and I guess now my response to Brett. And as I've discussed in my recent video on the Joe Rogan podcast, these low-carb keto carnivore crowds always seem to blame the food pyramid and the dietary guidelines on our high levels of disease today. But when you look at the level of adherence to dietary guidelines, it's hard to claim that the guidelines have caused so much disease when barely anybody has been following them strictly. So now that we understand how silly it is to attribute the obesity epidemic to something which the vast majority of people don't follow, let's rewatch Brett making this silly attribution.
How has that worked out for us? How has following their health guidelines worked out for anyone? Consider that seriously.
You know, it's really like this side of the internet will look for any excuse to blame the government for bad outcomes, further feeding into their anti-establishment contrarian narrative, even when we know that adherence to what is supposedly causing the issues is extremely low. What's also interesting to look at in this subject is what happens to people who actually do follow the dietary guidelines. And I mean, we should be looking at this research because even Brett asks,
how has following their health guidelines worked out for anyone? Consider that seriously.
So, here is a systematic review and meta-analysis of diet quality as it pertains to the Healthy Eating Index, and if you're unaware, the Healthy Eating Index basically mimics the dietary guidelines. The conclusion was that this updated systematic review and meta-analysis suggests that high diet quality, assessed by the Healthy Eating Index, alternate Healthy Eating Index, and dietary approaches to stop hypertension, is inversely associated with risk of all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease incidence or mortality, cancer incidence or mortality, type 2 diabetes, and neurodegenerative disease, as well as all-cause mortality and cancer mortality among cancer survivors. Moderate credibility of evidence for identified associations complements the recent 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report recommending healthy dietary patterns for disease prevention. So not only is it incredibly silly for people like Jordan and Ben Shapiro'S daughter to blame the dietary guidelines for people being obese because, no one's really followed them, but it's even more silly when you look at what actually happens to people's health when they do follow the dietary guidelines. Amazing. But you know what? We're just going to ignore all that evidence because they lied to us, though.
Another person said, "I remember when the federal government told us to eat 7 servings of bread a day." Oh yes, exactly. In order to keep your heart healthy.
So this person might be referring to the 1992 food pyramid, which to this person's credit did say 6 to 11 servings of bread, cereal, rice, and pasta. This food pyramid received much valid criticism, including not distinguishing between healthier versions of, say, foods like bread. For example, whole grain bread versus white bread. But it seems as though Brett and the person who made this comment are using the past mistakes included in the 1992 food pyramid to lend credence to the idea that today we shouldn't be listening to the government for nutritional advice. Well, if you look at the 2020 to 2025 guidelines today, you'll see that refined grains, like white bread, are categorized as a food we ought to minimize.
Anyway, back to the article. Their argument against meat is twofold. Number one, Americans are eating too much protein and protein is killing us. They say that Americans should be eating around 0.36 grams of protein per pound of weight, and they cite the National Academies of Science for this. But here's the kicker. According to the National Academies and the Institute of Medicine, this guideline is for the minimum amount of protein you should be eating in order to not fall into a deficit.
So when you go to the source for Vox's claim about the amount of protein we should be consuming, you'll find that they're talking about the RDA for protein. And contrary to what Brett is saying, the RDA for protein is not a minimum. RDAs in general are not a minimum. According to the National Research Council in the US, RDAs are neither minimal requirements nor necessarily optimal levels of intake. It is not possible at this time to establish optima. Rather, RDAs are safe and adequate levels, incorporating margins of safety intended to be sufficiently generous to encompass the presumed variability in requirement among people, reflecting the state of knowledge concerning a nutrient, its bioavailability, and variations among the US population. It would be incredibly silly if RDAs were just a minimum amount set to prevent deficiency without any safety margins put in place.
Also, women specifically, you probably should be eating a lot more protein than you are right now. Like, I did not realize how little protein I was eating every day until I started actually tracking it. And it is key for us if we want to regulate our hormones and lose weight, gain muscle, etc. Like, women do not eat enough protein. Do not listen to Vox.
I would cover this, but A Natural Vegan did a fantastic job covering this in her video, so I'll play a clip from hers now.
Women do not eat enough protein.
Really? Let's go through the numbers. The mean protein intake for American women is 15.7% of total calories. If we assume a 2,000 calorie diet, that would be 314 calories. Divide 314 by 4, which is the number of calories in 1 gram of protein, and we get 78.5 grams of protein. Again, the RDA for the average American woman is 62 grams. So American women are already getting more protein than the RDA. And this assumes a 2,000 calorie diet. American women are not eating 2,000 calories. The average caloric intake for men and women combined is 3,500 calories per day, which isn't surprising because, again, the average American woman weighs 171 pounds at 5'10", right? No, at just under 5'4". That's a BMI of 29.8, just under the obese cutoff. The average American woman is obese. And just for reference, I am the average American woman in terms of height. I am just under 5'4". I eat around 2,000 calories a day. I'm not exercising right now. I haven't been for weeks. And yet I weigh 134 pounds. Point is, clearly the average American woman is eating a lot more than 2,000 calories per day, which means the average American woman is getting way more than 78.5 grams of protein per day.
One commenter on Instagram, because they also posted this on Instagram, said, "This is irresponsible. You're going according to the RDA, which is a number that's the floor. RDAs are created as the absolute minimum to avoid disease. For example, the federal RDA of vitamin C is the absolute minimum you need to eat to avoid getting scurvy. Same for vitamin D and rickets. Posting this and allowing an aging population and an obese population to think that they don't need protein when it in fact is the number one way to avoid bone density loss is not only irresponsible journalism, it is harmful. Rethink this." Absolute mic drop.
Yeah, once again, the RDA is not the minimum. Even if at Alexa Grow My Business on Instagram thinks so.
So then why, according to Vox, are people getting so sick and having heart and cholesterol issues that they suddenly link to protein and meat? Could it have to do with the fact that our federal government, the government that they are so proudly citing, has been telling us that fiber is king and processed foods are better for us than animal products like eggs and butter and meat for over 50 years? Take a look at our health. How has that worked out for us? Again, I ask you, for the entire episode, how has listening to them worked out for us?
Yeah, I really don't know what else to say here. Somebody just needs to let these people know that barely anybody follows the guidelines. Although, to be honest, I suspect that if people like Brett were faced with this fact, they would still be motivated to spew this anti-guidelines garbage because it goes so well with their anti-establishment rhetoric, which their fans love so much. She keeps asking things like, how has that worked out for us? I think a better question is, how does following the guidelines work out for somebody who actually follows them? There's definitely a conversation to be had about why the guidelines have not been followed over the years, but to attribute all of our health problems to something that barely anybody has followed is incredibly silly. And what does she mean when she says that the government has said that processed foods are better for us than animal products? Which processed foods is she referring to? This term can include foods like Skittles all the way to whole grain bread, which, by the way, this paper covering whole grain intake, which included processed foods such as whole grain bread and breakfast cereals, found that a higher whole grain intake with or without added bran or germ was associated with a reduced mortality, especially deaths due to cardiovascular disease. These associations were independent of demographic and lifestyle predictors of mortality, as well as overall dietary quality, and largely persisted among participants with various risk profiles. And what do the 2020 to 2025 dietary guidelines recommend? They recommend prioritizing whole grains over refined grains. This is the kind of nuance that needs to be discussed and presented when people like Brett like to, condemn the dietary guidelines in the government for recommending the consumption of processed foods, though. Not all processed foods are bad. And here are some evidence that Brett is not reading the sources she deems credible on the screen.
Community Notes almost immediately jumped in with this banger, and they said, the tweet is written to imply that one can have too much protein. Current research does not support this assertion, and the tweet greatly oversimplifies protein consumption research. Instead, research points towards eating protein sources that have a package of benefits, almost like whole foods, almost like animal byproducts. Crazy! The vegans won't like that.
So here's the thing. The link in this tweet she is considering to be a good source literally recommends processed foods like whole grains for protein. And not only that, the article cites another article suggesting that plant protein may help you live longer, which cites a study finding that those who ate mostly plant protein instead of red meat or egg protein had a 13% to 24% lower risk of death from any cause. Funny how Brett deems a source credible, which is literally recommending plant foods over animal foods for protein, in a video where she was trying to convince you to consume more animal foods for protein.
And guys, if all of this meat is causing heart issues, then why does every cancer research foundation and cardio organization publish pieces like this? Ultra-processed foods are breaking your heart. Then this one is from the World Cancer Research Fund. Ultra-processed foods linked to increased cancer risk, diabetes, and heart disease.
So first of all, she says if all this meat is causing heart issues, why are there other causes of cardiovascular issues like ultra-processed foods? Simply pointing out that there was another food that is also increasing people's risk of cardiovascular disease does not prove that meat doesn't also do this. This is like saying, if cigarettes actually increase your risk of cardiovascular disease, then why are there all these other studies showing that ultra-processed foods increase your risk of cardiovascular disease? This might come across as mind-blowing, but there could be more than one cause to a negative health outcome. Wow. Now, remember what I said about Brett Cooper having the tendency in the past to make very bold claims without evidence? Well, we're about to get to her doing just that right now.
But what about the fact that the energy it takes to create all of this processed crap food and the synthetic, plant-based fake meat is worse for the environment than raising cattle?
There it is, a claim made without evidence. And it's also just a false claim. Raising cattle is one of the highest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. It also uses some of the most water. And when it comes to land use, beef is almost number one. Let's continue.
In fact, grass-fed cattle actually helps reduce carbon emissions.
Grass-fed cattle reduces emissions in comparison to what? This needs to be spelled out if you're going to make this kind of claim. But wait, she's actually going to provide a reference.
This is from Oregon State University. A new study finds that grass-fed beef reduces carbon footprint.
Okay, and just like the guy who cited a study advocating for sustainable beef in the recent Oxford Union debate, the paper she is citing advocated for farms that produce less emissions than the highest emitting food, beef raised on conventional farms, but nowhere near less emissions than plant foods. Again, if you're going to advocate for grass-fed beef as an alternative to all of these, quote, terrible plant foods for the environment, show that your grass-fed beef can emit less emissions than the plant foods you're advocating for people to replace with grass-fed beef. Also, it would only be fair to compare these more, quote, environmentally friendly versions of grass-fed beef to more environmentally friendly versions of plant agriculture, as opposed to the more industrial plant agriculture, which doesn't seem to intend to be, quote, better for the environment in the way that grass-fed beef does. But here's the thing. Even with this unfair comparison, industrial plant agriculture still comes out on top. All right, guys. That's the end of the video. Hopefully Ben Shapiro's daughter will see it. Thank you so much for watching. If you support my work and want to get early access to it, you can click the link in the pinned comment and support me on Patreon. And if you don't know, I do have a book going over most, if not all, of the anti-vegan arguments you're going to hear online. If you want to get that as well, that'll be linked in the pinned comment. Lastly, there are 2 links below for vegan protein powder and vegan merch, both of which, if you purchase, will help support the channel. And I'll see you in the next video.
Dude.
Fuck off. I don't want anything to do with you. Don't ever speak to me again. You're a fucking piece of shit.
Even vegans don't get your weird, stupid wannabe sense of irony here. Who is your audience? Nobody gets these dumb jokes. Dude,